Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that doesn't know what Mexican Coke is either. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. Just had a walk outside in the sunshine. It's still a bit cold, but it's definitely feeling like spring is in the air, or in the offing at least.
Definitely. The only reason I know that spring is in the air is because my Animal Crossing island no longer has snow on it. It's all green and exciting, and yeah, it's a big time on the island of Somerset. Things are happening.
I think we should probably just head straight on into our headlines. So we've got our papers link again for you, the new link that we mentioned before, so go there. We're going to start off with the Daily Mirror with the headline, Do One's Duty. What's that all about?
This is the news that the Queen's been vaccinated. Rejoice, everyone. The Queen is safe from the virus. And her message to go along with that, basically saying that, hey, you should go out and get the vaccination too. Which I think, we've mentioned it on loads of previous podcasts, but the vaccination effort in the UK seems to be progressing really, really well, with up to 30% of the population now at least receiving their first vaccination. I know that people who, have their second one lined up soon, so we will start to see that trickle through of people who will say, yes, I've had my full vaccination program done and dusted, and then we'll see how the world moves on with that, essentially, like what lockdown ends and what that means for the opening up of general services. I think we're slightly yet to have that conversation. I know a couple of weeks ago we discussed how Boris laid out his plan to his sort of roadmap to freedom, and everybody has that date of June 21st in their minds. We're kind of on stage one of that plan of reopening that's happening on Monday, which is tomorrow when we're recording this. So on the 8th of March, schools start to go back, which I'm sure is a great relief for parents everywhere. Maybe not so much the teachers, who I know a few have to sort of deal with very challenging conditions within school. There's obviously a load of things that you should aim to do within a classroom, but with budgets and what you can realistically do, that's always a challenge, I think, particularly with depending on the age of child that you're teaching. So I think that's going to be the real sort of first challenge for lockdown, and if this really is the last one, isn't it? Because we had schools go back previously, and kind of one of the first signs that we were going to have to go into a third lockdown was that there were schools up and down the country who felt that they couldn't open because the amount of staff that were off with the virus, or amount of pupils sent home to self-isolate, etc., etc. So just something to watch out for, but fingers crossed if that goes all well, then we'll see a sort of more opening up of lockdown in the near future.
And I think it's that first test of can we start to go back with a number of people vaccinated? I mean, I think we'd probably feel a bit more, not jovial, that's the wrong word, a bit more confident if we knew that all the teachers were getting vaccinated as frontline workers and stuff. But I know that that's not currently happening. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see, because I know people are I think it's April sometime that the pubs are supposed to reopen, and we're kind of come out into the tier system again in some ways. But yeah, that's about a month away, so it could be. A month is enough time for us to see if this was a bad move. So at least we'll know well in advance, I would imagine, of other things opening up, which is good. And I think that kind of staggered approach is better, but I'm still a bit unsure. And I think the thing is, no one wants another lockdown. And yeah, I think maybe there are some things that could be done to improve the chances here. If we'd vaccinated all the teachers, I'd probably feel a bit more bullish about this. But we're just going to have to wait and see 2 weeks from today. So probably around the time we record our next episode, we'll be able to say, how's it looking? So our next headline from The Times, another one featuring the Queen. Queen won't mention Harry and Meghan circus.
Yeah, so I was looking at the papers for this episode, trying to find relevant headlines. And unfortunately, all the papers have had this weird obsession with Harry and Meghan, which I don't really like to get involved with, but it's been talked about so much, I kind of feel like I have to do it because it's there all over the front pages. So this story in particular, this is from today, which is Sunday the 7th of March. This is the night that the interview with Harry and Meghan goes out, with them talking to Oprah about their experiences, etc. And essentially, a lot of the front papers have been very keen to tell us how much they don't care about that fact. I think the Daily Mail have devoted a whole 11 pages to how much they don't care about Harry and Meghan going on TV, which is incredible. And I just kind of wanted to mention it because it's baffling to me. Like, I tried to do some research into why Harry and Meghan are so vilified by the British press, specifically trying to look at facts facts and a timeline of events. And I had a look at the timeline and I couldn't really work out why we're so angry of them. You know, like you get these stories of people at war, don't you? Like these fictional tales of like, oh, they're at war, but they've been at war so long they don't even remember the reason it started. All you remember is that side A hates side B, and that's kind of how I'm feeling with the British press and Meghan Markle. I don't know if you have an opinion on this at all, Tom, but for me, it's just kind of baffling.
What the press has done has like hounding people. We've seen how that went in the past. That it's not good. I don't think that's a good idea. And I feel that like it does very much seem like they're picking on Meghan Markle because she's not white and also not British. I think that's basically my understanding of it. And so I'm not here for any of that. And it's terrible that they've had to like flee to another country essentially and set up shop. And it's like there's obviously internal politics inside the royal family that I don't really care about or know too much about. But this whole hounding by the press, I'm just not here for it, I think is my summary of it. Like I don't think they've done I think they've been doing things in bad faith from the get-go. And as you say, like at this point, I can't remember how it all started. But it does just seem like they should just shut up and leave them alone. And I know they're doing like a press conference over in the US that's being with Oprah that's being sold as this whole kind of, oh, it's going to be, the most revealing thing, etc. But, new TV shows always big that kind of stuff up. And I think, it's going to just, it keeps taking up the news. And I think, I don't know, it's not quite the same over here, but one thing I was listening to on some US politics podcasts, they were saying it's weird and baffling at the moment, talking about all these different disparate things. Like there's a big thing in the US going on about like cancel culture and things because the Dr. Seuss estate stopped some Dr. Seuss books from being published because they're racist. They just said, we're not going to publish them anymore. And then various Republican people were saying, oh, this isn't right, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, it's the Dr. Seuss estate. They can do what they like with their own copyright. Like it really weird that weird point where the Republicans who are always anti making laws about things suddenly move into that. Oh no, but we don't like this, so there should be a law about this thing. And we see the same thing over here, where like the Conservatives are weirdly acting a bit like Labour in some ways, with like suddenly giving out loads of money because of the coronavirus. I think that I know it doesn't affect us as much, but the fact that without Trump filling as many headlines in the US, they've suddenly having to find a lot of stuff to fill the airtime, and so you're getting some really odd stories going on in the US. Because politics is not the only thing now, which is kind of refreshing, but also a bit weird because the press gets really het up about some really minor rubbish when they've got nothing better to talk about. And I think that's how it always was before. And it's just a reminder of that weirdness that we used to have in the media where like something would become a story for a day or two. But yeah, without Trump tweeting something out all the time, we've lost some like filler that we had. I don't know how much that transfers over to the British media, but honestly, I don't read any of the British papers anymore because they're all rubbish.
It's a shame, isn't it? Yeah, like it's a shame that we have to go and say that, but particularly on the coverage of this story, I feel like there's not many papers taking a view where I'm like, sit up, hold back, what are the facts here? Like, let's take emotion out of this and what you feel about Meghan and Harry, and just explain to me again why we've got to be mad at them or her. I don't understand. But there's a lot. You can cut this. You can leave this in or cut this out. But you were talking about like weird American stories, like the other one that came up, like among cancel culture and like culture wars stuff, was that Mr. Potato Head thing.
Oh yeah. So again, I think this is a complete non-story where
Well, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, you go ahead. But
my understanding of it is that Hasbro mentioned something about Potato Head being the brand, and everyone was like, "Oh, they've taken the gender off Mr. Potato Head," despite the fact they still sell Mr. Potato Head and Mrs. Potato Head, which are very gendered products.
Under the brand of Potato Head.
Yeah, and yeah. So again, it's a nothing story that blew up because someone took offence and took offence at nothing that happened. Essentially, decided that people were changing things that weren't being changed. And there's a lot of stories like this, and like it's just there are other things to focus on. There are more important things to focus on, and it's not like even if that story were true, it's not important. Like.
Correct. Yeah. One, the story wasn't true in the first place. Two, it was bizarre that it became one of like the mini stories on the front of the Daily Telegraph, like a paragraph, which is where it concerns me because that's like, hey, my dad could read that paragraph and just not actually know about the fact that it's a brand change, and that it's just like a drip, drip, drip of information that will affect somebody reading it, and they might think, oh, the world's crazy, we can't even have Mr. Potato Head anymore. health and safety gone mad. It's political correctness gone mad. You know, like those kind of drips that were happening 10 years ago, that's kind of what it feeds into. When actually it's if responsible journalism was happening, it would be a complete non-story that would never make it to the front page of a national newspaper. But bizarrely it did. And I just feel that I understand that Harry and Meghan are royals and that makes them important for reasons. And that Harry is no longer a royal and it's like a big soap opera because everybody knows who they are. So we can all kind of have an opinion on it, I guess. The royal family is a great equalizer in that way, but still, the Queen won't mention the Harry and Meghan circus is the headline. Bizarrely, the Harry and Meghan circus has been one that has, in my opinion, completely been contrived by the newspapers rather than those two individuals themselves who are trying to get on with their lives. And if they're not going to be royals, they're going to try and earn a bit of cash on the side by having an interview with Oprah, because
I don't want to spend much more time on this, but I mean they are having an interview with Oprah, and the way that's being marketed, I can see being antagonistic back at the rest of the royals, but it's all the extra stuff around this where I'm just like, no one cares at the end of the day. Like, I don't care. Like, I think that is my summary. So let's move on to our main story. This is our chance to talk about the budget, which was announced on Wednesday last week. So we've had a bit of time to have a feel for what's happened. And yeah, it's the first one since coronavirus happened. So they kind of pushed off the budget because everything was unsure. But you have to have a budget every year, but it's actually every financial year. So despite the fact it's been over a year since it happened, this still counts as our budget for this year. It's a bit confusing from that point of view. Like, I think I remember people being like, oh, they can't push the budget off 6 months because then we won't have another budget. But because they've moved around how the budgets worked previously, this is fine within the rules so that nothing has been broken. But it is weird that we've been over a year without a budget, if you see what I mean. Is that a good That's a confusing summary, but that's how it feels trying to describe this to people.
Yeah, exactly. And, extraordinary circumstances, you can understand why this hasn't happened yet. But this seems to be like the first big test for Rishi Sunak, because I've called it in the notes here, first post-COVID budget. That might be a bit optimistic. COVID isn't over by any stretch, but it's
the first one where they're trying to deal with the fallout of having to spend a load of public money to keep everything going.
Precisely, yeah. So with that in mind, you've got they've got to take a look at like the state of the economy. Tax rises are generally expected because of the cost of lockdown, but that has to be balanced with helping small businesses in particular recover. You don't want to overtax, so it slows down recovery. So this is kind of the balancing act that he's got to try and negotiate. Most budgets start off with a general state of the economy. So unsurprisingly, the UK economy has shrunk by about 10% in 2020. Predicted to rebound with an annual growth of 4%, which is good. You would expect some regrowth, particularly as industries that have been completely wiped out by coronavirus, such as the holiday industry, the gig economy, going to places and seeing other people, businesses that are reliant on lots of people in a small place. That obviously hasn't been able to go on in the same way since lockdown. So you'd expect to see some bounce back from that as things start to open up again. We've seen, obviously, a great hit on people's jobs. Around 700,000 people have lost their jobs since the pandemic began, but they are expecting unemployment to peak next year at about 6.5%, which is much lower than the 11.9% that they previously predicted. So that's relatively reassuring that we seem to be bouncing back from this faster than we all expected, and that maybe the prolonged effects of lockdown won't last too long into 2022. Finally, one of the big figures was that we've borrowed more than we ever have before in peacetime, of 355 billion this year, and we expect borrowing to total 234 billion next year to try and cover COVID. So I think that's it just shows to you they're always huge numbers and sometimes they're quite hard to comprehend. But laid out like that, I think it's the first signs of oh, by the way, lockdown has cost an awful lot to the economy. That's what we all expected. But now we've kind of got the figures to put behind that as well.
Yeah, and I think the one thing to add on to that thing about the borrowing is that I think we're currently borrowing at the lowest rate in a long, long time as well. So part of the reason we've been able to easily borrow such a lot of money is that the borrowing markets have been good. And there's some discussion in economic spheres about how long that will last, because in the past, low interest rates have not held for a particularly long period of time. So then you have to start paying off more. But there are some people who suspect that this actually might be quite a long period of low interest rates. So it's going to be interesting. We can't tell yet how bad borrowing all that money is going to be. But the reason we're able to borrow so much easily at the moment is because of these low interest rates.
I think COVID being such a global thing and having such an impact on the global market means that you'd expect those ones to stay low, as everybody needs to have that help in recovery, don't they? So I would expect the borrow markets to carry on in that way. But yeah, it's quite a lot of money, isn't it, to claw back? So that's some of the challenges.
I can't comprehend it. Let's put it that way. Like it's into the silly money kind of numbers that you see when you talk about budget. It's like in the US when they're talking about $1 trillion for their equivalent COVID scheme at the moment, and it's like, well, my brain can't handle that amount of money. It's monopoly money at that point. So you mentioned COVID. So obviously we're seeing some of the effect there of the cost of furlough, etc. But is furlough sticking around for the near future? And what are their plans with regards to people who may have been self-employed and have therefore not had a job, essentially, though without furlough? And how are they also like focusing on the vaccine?
Yeah, so there's clearly, as we mentioned at the start, I call this post-COVID. Obviously, it's not. COVID is still going on. So there are a lot of COVID expenses that still have to be paid for. So part of the budget talk is dedicated to how we're going to fight COVID and what money's going to be available. So as you mentioned right at the top, furlough will be extended until September. That's an interesting month when you're thinking about it, because when we talked about things opening up apparently from June the 21st, the fact that furlough is still going on to September does suggest that, hey, we're still going to see a long tail on some businesses opening. Talking from just like my selfish desire to go to the cricket again and watch live sport, I know that they'll be restricted to sort of crowds of at least 50% capacity or 4,000, whichever is lower, which is a massive hit for clubs that are trying to, they make most of their money by filling the stadium. So that means they won't have to employ as many people as they would to try and keep, all those people safe if there was going to have a crowd of 20,000, etc. So I think it does show that even though everybody's kind of touting that date, June 21st, as freedom, there are still going to be some limitations that come with that, and the government is planning on that and knowing that not everybody's suddenly going to rush back to work on that day. But I think that is reassuring for people that they know that safety net is extended until September. If we thought how we were talking about this in last year, we've talked about COVID a lot. The original furlough scheme was meant to end in October of last year, and they extended that just sort of like right at the end, at the last minute. The fact that it's going on till September suggests that there will nearly have been 2 full years of some government support for those in unemployment, or those who are were employed by a company and then have to be sort of like temporary put to the side, as that's what furlough does. So good news, I think, in general, that the government is choosing to support that and that the safety net won't be taken straight away. There's also more for people who are self-employed to get help. There was some self-employed allowance, but the net has kind of been widened to include up to 600,000 more people, so they'll get that money. Good news again that the government is supporting that, but I kind of feel that, we've been at this for a year now. Self-employed people are the ones who are probably going to be hit the hardest, considering that, depending on the nature of their jobs. So the fact that 600,000 people may have gone without that for such an extended period of time is a bit of a worry that we weren't stepping up to help them sooner. But at least there is some money available for them now. And sticking with kind of like the benefit schemes, you've got extra £20 a week for those on universal credit to stay. That was £20. Doesn't sound like a much. It does seem like tiny. The government would tell you that that's up to an extra £1,000 a year. However, this is only be extended for 6 months' time, and in 6 months' time, then that will be what's the 9th month? September again. And then you start getting into winter with different expenses such as heating, and I don't know that. This extra £20 is something that is touted as such like a lifeline for people who are on very tight budgets, and if I imagine that people are barely scraping by with that extra £20 at the moment. So to have the sort of like threat of it being taken away when it comes to winter and you've got additional expenses coming in, I can't imagine many people on universal credit are particularly happy that this is only a temporary extension of that extra £20. And finally, just on COVID expenses, there's an extra 1.6 billion for vaccines, which I think is the way the government sees of us getting out of this crisis and getting the economy back open. I think an extra 1.6 billion for vaccines to get the economy back open is like a very sound investment by the government, and I don't think anybody's blinking an eye at them putting so much money towards that project. We'll talk about maybe some other projects that have cost a lot of money that people are certainly getting a bit angsty about there being so much money for them. But this one in particular does seem to have like the thumbs up from everybody involved. I think more money for vaccines is something that we can all get behind.
So we're talking here about various things we've had to find money for or will be finding money for. And we mentioned earlier, eventually we're going to have to pay for this, even if we're borrowing a lot to cover it right now. So presumably the easiest way to fix that would just be to increase tax. But obviously, if you start taxing everyone who's currently having to, struggle with not necessarily having a job, etc., that's a hard line to walk. So what have the government done with regards to taxation?
Yeah, so there's a propose for tax-free personal allowance to be frozen from April for those who are earning £12,570 a year. That'll be frozen at about 20%, and then the higher income tax rate, which is at 40%, that'll be frozen at £50,270 from April, and that'll stay for around about 5 years.
The first thing is the personal allowance. That's the amount that you always get tax-free, isn't it? And then the second one is a threshold for super tax, as they call it.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
So that means the first £12,570 you earn in a year are tax-free, and then above that, every pound is taxed based on whatever tax bracket.
20%. And then, like the super tax, or the higher income tax rate at 50,270, that will be at 40%, and that will stay from April 2021 to 2026. So that might mean that some people oddly get into like different tax brackets, even if they have a wage rise, which is, might be concerning for some people. Other people who might never, even get into that higher tax bracket might think, okay, that's fine. So the impact on the personal purse won't be that much, all things considered, and they have raised that. One of the bigger headline figures is that you've got corporation tax on company profits, those companies that earn over £250,000, that will rise from 19% to 25% in 2 years' time in April 2023. So that is a big tax rise of 6%, gives those corporations a lot of time to get ready and fund accordingly. But the government is certainly focusing on that, on the companies that are already making money or continue to make money through the pandemic. That's who they're going to tax. Then if you have a look at those businesses affected by COVID, that's where the taxation seems to go off again.
I mean, and this is kind of a perfect example of what we alluded to earlier, where this seems like a very Labour policy to say, let's tax the businesses a bit more. And here are the Conservatives coming out with policies that you would normally expect Labour to come out with. Yeah,
they've been forced to. It seems bizarre that at the end of 2020 we were discussing Jeremy Corbyn's policy and Boris Johnson's policy when it came to taxation and what the government provided for people for free. Essentially, a lot of those in the Conservatives scoffed at the idea of Jeremy Corbyn's spending. Now, because of COVID, they've been forced to spend on a level that was even way beyond anything that Labour could have envisaged. Essentially, when they put that idea forward in 2020, and now they're realising they have to pay for it. The only way you can do that is by raising taxes, really. When so many businesses are struggling to grow in the current climate anyway, you can't rely on, we'll just have business-friendly policies and they'll grow. We can keep taxes the same because we'll be making more money off of that percent because it'll be so much larger. It's just not feasible at the moment. So I think that's fairly sensible to go after those companies with a lot of profit. And then the rate will be kept at 19% for about 1.5 million smaller companies with profits of less than 50,000. So those smaller businesses who are doing just enough to get by, who got really hit hardly by COVID, that's who the government is going to try and protect with lower taxation, which it seems to me like a sensible approach, because to do a blanket tax on all business would just seem bizarre. That would only be a way of killing off smaller businesses faster and essentially giving, allowing those bigger businesses to grow even more as they try and fill in those gaps.
And so with those So not just those businesses who have a smaller profit, but what about those businesses who have been harder hit by COVID? So I'm thinking about arts venues, for example, that have been closed, and as you mentioned earlier, like sports, professional sports that have had to shutter their doors. Again, I know it's not as simple with the sports as like, because they obviously lost a lot of income, but also were able to cut a lot of costs. But yeah, what's the plan with those kind of areas of the business world?
So particularly with the arts, there's nearly 400 million there to help venues in England, including museums and galleries, reopen, which I think is seen as a much needed lifeline for the arts. They were a sector that seemed to be pretty sidelined early on, and there was a lot of noise from professionals in that industry that they were just being overlooked. So it's reassuring that they're now getting some funding. But again, some may argue that is too little, too late. We'll have to see what the impact is on them. What they really need is for the lockdown to be over and for them to go back to their pre-COVID levels of foot traffic, etc., and getting people in through the door. I'm sure once things are open, people would love to go to the cinema, the theatre, whatever they do to try and get out and about. They'll certainly won't be short on demand. It'll then be, how the government manages, how many people are allowed in a venue, etc., and how businesses can get through that transitional period. I think that's why that money will be needed to support those venues, in particular, even as we sort of like roll on into 2022. And in particular, when you look at sports facilities and how particularly those at a grassroots level have coped. So a lot in the elite, clearly the Premier League still goes because there's a lot of money in television rights. And at the moment, I think almost every game is being televised because that's the only way that fans can get to see the football. And television rights are sold at a ridiculously high rate. That's what most of the clubs base their budget on. Clearly, they want people in through the door as well, but the TV rights are enough to get them through. Grassroots just don't have that. I think even the lower leagues below the national levels in men's football, like some of the conference ones, they decided to stop playing halfway through the season. They all voted and said, no, we'll call this off, simply because they were like, we don't see the point without fans there. We can't get in. That's our source of profit. We just seem to be running this for no apparent reason. So they closed their doors. So there will be a 300 million recovery package for professional sport, 25 million for grassroots football, and 1.2 million to help stage a delayed women's Euro football tournament that was meant to be held in England in 2022. So fingers crossed that can still go ahead. We don't know where we'll be in 2022. Fingers crossed things will be a lot more open by then. But those are the businesses that, there's been a lot affected. But I think nobody can deny that these industries in particular have been hit particularly hard by COVID restrictions, and they still need our help going on to the next 3-6 months until the next budget is released.
Yeah, and I think most people would agree that those are good things to be putting money into. I think people might disagree with the amounts not being enough, especially I think the arts. I mean, when you look at the big numbers we're borrowing, 400 million does seem quite small overall. But again, I don't know how much money is needed to prop these venues up, but you can already see, I mean, like even the V&A and other, large museums, we're not talking even about the small museums where, I'm sure there are many stories of how they're having to cut costs and stuff now. But things like the V&A, like restructuring and smushing all of their departments together because and letting go of, I think, 25% of their curating staff. And that's even with this money being promised. A lot of this is coming a bit too late to save a lot of jobs. And you think maybe it could be a bit more money to help out. I don't really have much more to add there other than it's a bit rubbish if you're in those industries that it's been taken so long for a reasonable package to be put forwards, and then it's probably not enough money overall. I don't have much to say on that other than it's a bit of a rubbish situation, and it feels that does feel a bit too little too late, but it's better than nothing, at least. On a related thing, and again, this is why this kind of maybe seems, again, I don't have, like, I'm just talking on the numbers I'm seeing here, and I'm not an economist, and I'm also not in like public policy or anything like that. So you're trying to work out these numbers. So there's also now this help for the regions for promoting regeneration in the north. Now, that does seem like a sensible idea. and it's not just the north. There are some places further south as well. There's £1 billion to promote regeneration in 45 English towns. But I think you're probably going to have a bit to talk about here, because it seems that 40 out of 45 towns there are some of these red wall areas that have recently got Conservative MPs. So it feels like maybe this is more of a vanity project than it seems on the face of it.
Yeah. So the Conservatives have been big about a levelling up agenda over the whole of the UK, because the argument, particularly from the Conservatives, has been for years that Labour focuses too much on the cities, and although cities clearly need investment to help their people, they are invested in at a rate that comes at the expense of some of the more rural towns, which are particularly led by Conservative MPs. So what is needed is a big help to, fund towns outside of that kind of like London-centric bubble and those city bubbles, and reinvest in towns that happen to be outside of that area. That requires a huge amount of money and levelling up so the whole country can get to the level that London is. That's the aim of the Conservatives, and it's quite a popular idea, I think, with good reason. As somebody who lives in the countryside and, goes to London and feels like very much a country bumpkin, to think, that we could have something, we could have facilities akin to London in any way would be amazing. So apparently all these towns could apply, and essentially the civil service did a bit of an algorithm to find out which towns were more deserving of money. The Ministry of Housing and Communities rank English towns by an index of deprivation, the most deprived, on a formula based on income deprivation, skills, productivity, exposure to economic shocks and the impact of Brexit, level of private investment, and eligibility for other government funding, which could be combined with towns fund money. And essentially from that algorithm of like 541, you'd think that this money would be assigned to the 45 ones at the top of that list. However, as you mentioned, 40 out of 45 of these towns have a Conservative MP, and one that stood out in particular was Cheadle, which was down at the bottom of that list, meaning that it was the least deprived. I think it was seventh bottom from that list, but it still was eligible for funding. When you think you've got like 500 towns, how did one that far down the list become eligible? It appears that, that algorithm is a suggestion for the MPs and the people in charge of that money, and then they make the decision. They have the final say on how those funds get allocated, because, hey, as we're aware with the exams fiasco, the algorithm isn't always right. There are sometimes other factors outside of that you need to consider. However, on the face of it, I think with that 40 out of 45, there does seem to be something a little bit suspect about how that money was decided, and maybe civil service advice wasn't taken at every stage. And it is reminded that, the civil service is there just to advise. It's the ministers who make the final decision. I'm sure the 45 towns who get allocated that money will feel very grateful for it, and it's certainly something great to put in your election literature next time round, that you've helped reinvest into your local community. That's why people voted Conservative, because they wanted to help that levelling up agenda, etc., etc. But maybe when you look a little bit deeper into how how it works and which towns are actually most deserving, there does seem to be something a little bit fishy there.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to disparage the idea. I think, as you say, like there are definitely places in need of help. I think the problem is more, is it self-aggrandizing for these new MPs who've appeared in these, specifically in these kind of old red wall areas where you would expect that they need to try and come up with a plan for keeping hold of them in the future so they don't revert to Labour. It does seem a little bit suspicious. Like, the idea is fine. It's more that as you say, if someone is seventh from the bottom of that list and magically ends up in the top 45, that does seem a bit weird. And then also, I mean, I don't know, like, maybe it's because it's more infrastructure kind of stuff, that pool of money is more, but you would imagine that the arts venues in England, which includes museums and galleries, is a lot more than 45 distinct places that are getting 400 million split between them. And then you have 1 billion going over 45 places. Again, it's like without knowing enough, and I appreciate I'm coming from an ignorant viewpoint here with regards to how that money is going to be spent. But it does seem like maybe they could have put more money into these other things as well. So you do also wonder if that's part of it as well. But yeah, we can sit here and question, I suppose, On another thing where it seems like possibly not enough money being spent, given how much we're borrowing, public sector pay, what's happening over there?
Yes, so public sector pay has been frozen across the board for 2021, 2022, with one notable exception, which is nursing and the NHS. So quite rightly, I think the government realised that, nurses in particular have had a very hard time throughout COVID. They've been on the front line dealing with a pandemic, the first one, in years and years and years, etc., etc. So they required something to say thank you. However, this has come in the shape of a 1% pay increase, which some people have pointed out essentially is the equivalent of £3.50 a week. So enough for a takeaway sandwich meal deal, which understandably nurses and even the Royal College of Nurses have come back and said, hey, that's not really enough and that's not much of a thank you. It's even led to some people saying, like the government is having a let them eat claps agenda because, they're the first to say, yes, we should go out and applaud our NHS staff and, get them through this time that we've been having, but are unable to stump up any sort of meaningful pay increase as a real thank you, which is what those on the front lines have wanted.
And again, a pay rise that's not in line with inflation is tantamount to a pay cut. So
yes, inflation is meant to be like 1.5%, and this is 1%, so it's actually in real terms like a 0.5% pay cut, which isn't great. This is a figure that it kind of took a couple of days to come out of the budget, because I felt that the budget seemed to go quite well for Rishi Sunak and was certainly polling quite well. But once it went a little bit deeper and they found out that this was the reward, this seems to have gained a lot of traction on the front pages, as well as within just like the public consciousness of people going, hey, I think nurses should maybe be paid a little bit more, considering everything they've done. Now, if you're the government here, I can kind of see why you would be reluctant to have a 1% pay increase across the board or anything more than that, because the NHS is so huge and has a lot of budget goes on staffing costs. So I think the current staffing cost budget at the moment of the NHS is 56.1 billion. So a 1% pay increase across the board would equate to more than 500 million a year. So that is quite a lot of money that the government is is thinking that it's going to expend over a number of years, particularly if it doesn't want to cut nurses' pay at a later date and they only see it increasing, then the government is going to have to pay up. But personally, I would see that as a wise investment in nursing to say thank you. We had a couple of years ago, under Theresa May's government, a junior doctors strike because of the low pay that junior doctors have in the first years of their training. Nursing is clearly a vocation. It's something that people don't necessarily go into for the money. If they started to go into it for the money, I think they'd be shocked at how little it does pay, particularly in those early years. But the fact that the government is unable to come up with more money, and their excuse at the moment is we can't justify a bigger pay increase, I think that bites, in particular when you have a look at other things the government has invested in when it comes to coronavirus. Most notably, I think track and trace is one of those ones where it's 37 billion has been allocated to track and trace, and I've got to be careful about how you word it, because that's a big headline figure. So I made sure that I've gone back and looked up the facts of this. So originally 22 billion was allocated to the track and trace system, and that's been increased by 15 billion in this budget, which brings it to 37 billion. What you get as that as a nation, how the money is allocated, is a bit more funny, but they're not simply just paying 37 billion for an app you have on a phone or an app that runs in an out-of-date spreadsheet or whatever the government decides to do with that money. But it would also cover those payments people get for going off if they've got a positive test. Then they can apply to the government to have, £500 a week or something to cover their lost earnings that they would have gone to work for instead. So that is tied into it. But I think it's fair to say that people certainly don't see track and trace as value for money at the moment, and as a system that was, I think at the start it was touted as a system that was meant to keep our economy going and was meant to keep us out of lockdown because we could keep the R rate low, because we would track and trace effectively, people would isolate effectively, therefore the track and trace would pay for itself because the economy would be open. I think it's fair to say that it hasn't really achieved that goal. And when you compare 500 million a year to 37 billion on a perceived failed system, and then you add in other failures that the government has had, like I can't really say like allegedly anymore, because Matt Hancock, it was said by a judge in court just a couple of weeks ago that he had acted unlawfully giving out PPE contracts, and certainly those are coming under scrutiny with how wisely the government spent that money to protect doctors and nurses, because you have to remember at the start of this crisis there was a PPE shortage. Those nurses who are giving a 1% pay increase now had to go to work knowing that they didn't have the adequate PPE protection to protect themselves from what was a deadly disease, but they went in and did it anyway because that's what they do. So yes, I think there's a lot of stories at the moment where you have to look at like the government is spending, what it is willing to spend money on, and what it's not. And I think it is a little bit of a scandal that they've only increased nurses' pay by 1%.
Yeah, I think it is kind of telling that 37 billion on track and trace, and don't get me wrong, I understand that some of that is, like as you say, paying out to people who are having to stay at home because of it and other things. But you divide that by 500 million, and you could pay that 1% pay rise to nurses for 74 years. Kind of puts it in perspective how much money has been spent on something that, if you ask the average person on the street, would they rather give that money to the NHS or to test and trace? I think I know what the answer would be most of the time.
Yeah, totally. And there's another way that annoys me about these things get framed, and apologies if I get a bit communist about this, you can tell me off later. But the government says there's not enough money for a pay rise, and this kind of comes about like me listening to these debates happening on the radio. And somebody will pipe up and say, well, it's not just nurses that require a pay rise. Think of the hospital cleaners, the portering staff that also put their lives at risk. Don't they deserve a pay rise too? And my answer to that is like always like, yes, these people do deserve a pay rise. Like those working on the front line during coronavirus have probably universally been underpaid for a while and should have a little bit more money. But we can't just act like the government tries to turn it into a fight, as in, we've only got this much money, you've got to fight amongst yourselves to get this cash. Whereas really, those people could band together and look upwards and say, no, as a group, we refuse to get paid so little. Maybe the government should fork out and help everybody out a little bit more. That would be my opinion on these things. And that's where I get frustrated, where, you know, like some people just come out of the woodwork and say, well, it's not just nurses that did this. Just think of the people in the supermarkets working, you know, throughout the crisis. They should be paid more too. And to them, I say, yes, they definitely should be paid more. They probably get underpaid too, and that is the increased profits that supermarkets have experienced throughout this crisis. That should go back to the workers, etc., to pay them, to thank them for working through this time. But yeah, there's an awful lot where you look at money, you look at figures, and it's hard to see how the government could, like you say, that's the fact that you can have that 1% pay rise for 74 years if you chose to for the effect of test and trace. Obviously, if you raise it by 2%, that number is halved. That's how maths works. So maybe they can't quite justify the 12.5% that I believe the Royal College of Nursing is going after, because that would be the best pay rise actually in line with inflation and taking into account this kind of like real term losses that they've had year on year from wages not going up with inflation each time. Like there's always a bit of lag that happens there. So I don't think they're going to get the 12.5%, but there is now a real danger that we may see a nursing strike happen because there's so little being paid, which would be, clearly nobody wants that in a pandemic. And I do think that any nurses that decided to go on strike would find that a particularly hard decision to make, because you go into nursing to look after people and not going into work knowing that you won't be looking after people. I think that's going to be a decision that personally people are going to find very hard to make. But some action does need to be taken, maybe some direct action, if the government refuses to give more than a 1% pay increase.
Yeah. And I think another thing to mention, of course, is that it is very hard. I believe the rules for striking have been changed since the junior doctors strike, so it makes it a lot harder. Like, if the nurses do end up striking, I think it's over 50% of their members. So that is an impressive, like that would really send the signal if that happens. But as you say, it's a tough personal decision to make. But also, we can only expect so much from people where they're being underpaid for what is an essential service that everyone needs. And especially like if coronavirus is not the thing that makes you realize that we need to be paying our doctors and nurses more. But you know, I mean, most doctors are generally end up in a pretty good position after a few years, but still the junior doctor pay is still not fixed since those strikes. So yeah, if this isn't the thing that sways you, I don't know what will. But I think, if the nurses are able to go on a strike, that should send a very, very strong message, given that it would be over 50% of all of the nursing unions voting for it.
Yeah, totally. We'll have to wait and see what happens. But I think that was just the to give the fair assessment on the budget in total. Rishi Sunak clearly had a very hard remit in front of him. Some things I feel that he's got right, or at least where some of the money gone, he seems to have been prioritising some of it quite well. But yeah, just that nurses' pay rise thing in particular is one thing where I think you can point to it and go, the government does need to show a bit more support to those who got them through this crisis. Boris Johnson was praising those doctors and nurses who helped him whilst he was suffering himself from the disease.
Yeah, it's a read the room moment. Everyone is saying, it's a running joke for comedians and stuff to say stuff about having another clap for the NHS when they should be getting money. Like, everyone knows that they should be getting money. So, yeah, the fact that this is the pay rise they get, it's not enough. It's that simple. Okay. I think that's it. That's our overview of the budget. We don't have any particular polls to go with this. But again, if you do find a fun poll, tweet it at us, send it to us on our website. You can find us all over the place. Find us on Facebook. You can send us an email at unparliamentary@tinkertailorsoldersponge.com. And you can also find us in all the usual places. So you can go to our website, which is parliamentary.observer, where you can discuss the episode and find links to subscribe on the various podcatchers out there. You can go and find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Twitter at unparlpodcast. You can find us on Instagram also at unparlpodcast. And if you think you would like to give us a bit of money to help the show run, keep the website hosting costs down and all that kind of thing, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support us from as little as $1 a month. And with that said, I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Hi. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mish Mash Mayhem, and you can find out.